the autumn sun filtered through the tall windows of the village hall in Little Hartleton, casting long shadows across the refreshment tables laden with Victoria sponge, scones, and jam tarts. The annual Harvest Festival tea had been a tradition for 43 years. A reliable fixture in the social calendar that gave the village women and a few steadfast men an opportunity to display their domestic prowess and community spirit in equal measure. Miss Marple sat in her customary position near the window, her hands occupied with a cup of Earl Grey and a small plate of homemade shortbread. At 84 years of age, she had perfected the art of appearing decorative and slightly detached while observing everything with the penetrating clarity that had made her, in her own quiet way, an instrument of considerable investigative power. She was dressed as always in sensible shoes and a lavender cardigan, her white hair arranged in the neat curls she maintained with weekly precision. "Absolutely splendid turnout," said Mrs. Bantry, settling into the chair beside her with an air of satisfaction. Mrs. Bantry had been chairman of the Harvest Festival Committee for the past 6 years, and took considerable pride in the event's continued success. "Better than last year, I'd say. The cake stall alone has raised nearly £40. "Most impressive," Miss Marple agreed, her pale blue eyes moving across the room with apparent casualness. Yet nothing escaped her notice, not the way young Timothy Ashford's hand rested possessively on Margaret Denham's shoulder, nor the tight smile that crossed Patricia Denham's face at the sight of them together. Not the nervous fidgeting of old Mr. Saunders as he stood by the door, watching the crowds with the intensity of a man watching a judgment day. Not the careful distance maintained between Henry Blackwood, the proprietor of the corner shop on High Street, and his wife Eleanor, who sat at opposite ends of the refreshment table. Despite being married for 22 years, the village hall, a Victorian structure of red brick and good intentions, was comfortably full. The Reverend Collins moved among the gathered crowd with clerical cheerfulness, dispensing compliments and encouragement. The school teacher, Miss Jennifer Hart, stood near the display of seasonal vegetables, chatting with Dr. Ashford, Timothy's father. In the corner, young Constable Barnes helped Mrs. Whitmore arrange the flowers, white chrysanthemums and autumn leaves in copper urns, with the careful attention of someone trying to make an impression. It was 5 minutes past 3 o'clock when Margot Blackwood burst through the doors of the hall. She was 31 years old, though her appearance suggested both less and more than this. Her face had the peculiar quality of beauty that appeared effortless until one looked closely enough to see the mechanisms of its construction. Her dark hair was arranged in fashionable waves, her lipstick a vivid red that matched the carnation in her lapel. She wore an emerald green dress that fit her slim figure with the precision of couture, and her eyes had the glittering quality of a woman possessed of some important secret. No one spoke as she entered. The tea urns seemed to pause their steaming. Conversations reduced themselves to whispers. Margot Blackwood was, after all, the wife of Henry Blackwood, the wrong wife, as the village understood these matters. She had married him 4 years ago, a mere 2 years after his divorce from Eleanor, his first and legally sanctioned wife. Eleanor Blackwood, dignified and martyred in her silence, remained in Little Hartleton, living in a small cottage on the edge of the village, supported by the generosity or the guilt of her former husband's income. The village had taken sides with remarkable unanimity in the matter, and those sides favoured Eleanor, who had raised 2 children and endured 20 years of marriage only to be cast aside for a woman young enough to be her daughter. Margot, for her part, had never shown any signs of discomfort with her position. She had taken over the flat above the corner shop with the confidence of a woman who believed herself to be precisely where she ought to be. If she felt the weight of the village's disapproval, she concealed it with admirable skill. "Henry isn't feeling well," Margot announced, moving to the refreshment table with the ease of someone accustomed to claiming space in any room. "Nothing serious, just a disagreeable headache. He asked me to convey his apologies to the committee." Mrs. Bantry rose slightly in her chair, the epitome of wounded dignity. "I am sorry to hear it. His usual contribution to the raffle was much anticipated." "Oh, he wanted to bring something," Margot said, selecting a cup of tea with the precision of someone consulting a wine list. "A hamper, actually. Quite generous. But the headache came on so suddenly after lunch that he felt compelled to retire. Men are dreadfully helpless when they're unwell, aren't they?" She smiled, and the smile contained something that wasn't quite warmth. "Though I suppose all husbands are the same in that respect, some more so than others." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor Blackwood, who had been in conversation with the Reverend, suddenly found the teacup in her hands absorbing all of her attention. Miss Marple, having observed this small exchange with the attention usually reserved for Shakespearean tragedy, noted several things. The deliberate nature of Margot's timing, arriving after the peak of the party when her presence would cause maximum disturbance. The pointed reference to being a wife, with its implicit contrast to Eleanor's status as an ex-wife. And most interesting of all, the peculiar quality of her mention of Henry's illness. The headache had come on so suddenly after lunch. A specific detail. A detail that suggested nothing more than thoughtfulness in its mention, but which, to Miss Marple's practised ear, contained echoes of explanation. "I do hope he feels better soon," Miss Marple said gently. "Headaches can be quite dreadful. I find that mine are often worst in the afternoon, particularly if I've had something that disagreed with me at lunch." Margot's teacup paused halfway to her lips. For perhaps half a second, her composure wavered. "Yes, well, he ate something that didn't quite agree with him, I think. From the corner shop, ironically enough. He was sampling some new stock." "How unfortunate," Miss Marple said. "These things do happen in small villages, don't they? One never quite knows where food has come from, or how long it's been sitting about." The conversation moved on. Margot took a seat near the door, a strategic position, Miss Marple noted, that allowed her to observe and be observed. Mrs. Bantry returned to her administrative discussions. The tea continued to steam in its urns. Outside, the autumn afternoon deepened toward evening, and the light took on that particular quality that comes only in the autumn months, golden and fleeting and somehow sad. It was 4:30 when Constable Barnes received the telephone call. He had been outside at that moment, smoking a cigarette in the small garden at the rear of the hall, away from the sharp eyes of the village women who disapproved of smoking in public spaces. The call came through to the village police station, and Sergeant Pittman, who was a man of glacial temperament and reliable judgment, came to find him with the news that Henry Blackwood had been taken ill, seriously ill, and that Dr. Ashford had been called to the cottage above the corner shop. The matter, Pittman said, might require police attention. The nature of this potential criminality remained unclear, but by 5 o'clock, word had travelled through the village hall with the speed and thoroughness of a well-aimed arrow. Henry Blackwood, difficult, somewhat unpleasant Henry Blackwood, who had owned the corner shop for 23 years, and who had scandalized the village with his divorce and remarriage, had been poisoned. Or so the rumour went, and rumour, as Miss Marple well understood, was rarely entirely wrong about the essentials, even when it was sometimes quite wrong about the particulars. By the following morning, the poisoning of Henry Blackwood had transformed from rumour into established fact, though the details remained wonderfully various, depending on who was doing the telling. Miss Marple, seated in the front parlour of her cottage with her knitting, a baby's blanket in pale yellow, intended for the vicar's sister, heard no fewer than 7 different accounts before lunchtime. The most reliable version came from Mrs. Bartlett, who delivered the milk, and who had obtained her information directly from Dr. Ashford's nurse, who happened to be her cousin. "Strychnine," Mrs. Bartlett said, setting down the milk bottle with the gravity of one announcing a royal death. "That's what Dr. Ashford thinks anyway. Henry's taken horribly ill, violently ill if you understand me, and the symptoms fit. He's in considerable pain, poor man. They've sent for a specialist from the city." "How dreadful," Miss Marple murmured. "And no one knows how the poison came to be in his system." "That's the curious part," Mrs. Bartlett said, settling into the offered chair as though she had been invited to give testimony at a trial. "He was at his shop, you see, doing the accounts after the morning customers had gone. His wife, the second wife I mean, brought him a cup of tea at around 2:30. He drank it, and within the hour, he was in dreadful agony. Thought it was an ordinary stomach complaint at first, but then the convulsions began. Dreadful, from what I hear. The doctor said if it had been any stronger a dose, he'd likely be dead." "And the cup of tea?" Miss Marple asked, her needles continuing their steady rhythm. "Has it been examined?" "The cup's been taken to the police, but there's not much left to examine. The wife, Margot, rinsed it out before anyone thought to preserve it. Though I dare say the police won't hold that against her. She's the one who called for help after all. She seems as shocked as anyone." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her pale eyes fixed on the baby blanket taking shape beneath her needles. "And her husband, the first husband that is. How does Eleanor bear the news?" "Eleanor's maintaining a dignified silence on the subject, as far as I can see. Though you might have noticed that she didn't attend the tea yesterday afternoon. The school closed early. Miss Hart sent the children home early on account of the situation. It's all quite unprecedented." When Mrs. Bartlett had departed with the satisfied air of someone who had distributed news of maximum importance, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and considered the morning's information with the care she might have applied to a particularly intricate jigsaw puzzle. The poisoning itself presented several obvious features. The choice of strychnine, which was not a subtle poison, and which would produce violent and unmistakable symptoms. The administration through a cup of tea, which suggested some familiarity and access to the victim. And most curious of all, the preservation of the cup, which had been rinsed before examination. This last detail was not necessarily incriminating. Perfectly innocent people rinsed cups out of habit. But it was, nonetheless, noteworthy. And then there was the question of motive, which was not simple at all. Henry Blackwood was not, by all accounts, a particularly likable man. He had made his fortune, a modest fortune by any standard, through the corner shop, which he had operated for more than 2 decades, with an eye toward profit and a singular indifference to the comfort of his customers. He had a reputation for sharp dealings, for selling stock that was approaching its sell-by date at full prices, for maintaining prices higher than the larger stores in the neighbouring town. He had divorced his first wife, Eleanor, a woman of quiet respectability, in favour of a woman 20 years his junior, a choice that had scandalised the village and earned him the permanent disapproval of nearly everyone in Little Hartleton who could remember Eleanor's quiet dignity through the process. Yet he had provided for Eleanor, or so it was said. And he employed 2 assistants in the shop, a young man named David Pearson and a woman named Mrs. Watkins, who had worked for him for 17 years, and who was, by most accounts, devoted to him in the manner of employees who have come to regard their employment as a kind of calling. Margot, his second wife, had seemed content enough with her position, though contentment was perhaps not the word one would use for a woman who had married a man 25 years her senior. There were rumours, of course. There were always rumours in villages such as Little Hartleton, but rumours were not evidence. And Miss Marple had learned long ago that rumours were often born from the human capacity for disappointment and resentment, rather than from any real substance. So, where was the motive? And perhaps more importantly, where was the opportunity? It was at the village shop itself where Miss Marple began her observations in earnest. The shop sat at the corner of High Street and Maple Lane, a Victorian building of considerable character and minimal charm. Its windows displayed, somewhat haphazardly, tins of biscuits, jars of jam, bottles of pickled onions, and a collection of other necessities that the village required. The proprietor's flat occupied the space above, accessed through a narrow door beside the shop entrance. It was here, according to the reports, that Henry Blackwood had taken his poisoned cup of tea. Miss Marple, leaning on her walking stick and moving with the careful deliberation of advanced age, entered the shop at approximately 10:30 on the morning following the poisoning. The shop had closed the previous evening and remained closed this morning, but at 10 o'clock it had been opened by Mrs. Watkins, who was seeing to the regular business, while the proprietor lay in considerable pain and diminishing coherence in the flat above. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Watkins said, looking up from behind the counter with an expression that combined surprise and a kind of harried sympathy. "How good of you to come. Business has been quite extraordinary this morning. Everyone is agog about poor Mr. Blackwood, of course, and curiosity brings custom." Mrs. Watkins was a woman of approximately 55 years, with the worn appearance of someone who had devoted her life to work and the satisfaction of others. She had been married once, briefly, to a man who had gone to Australia and never returned, and she had raised 2 children on her wages from the shop. Her son worked in the city as an accountant. Her daughter had married a farmer and lived several villages over. Mrs. Watkins seemed to regard the shop as her true family, and her concern for Henry Blackwood's welfare appeared genuine. "I have come to select a few items," Miss Marple said, moving slowly through the shop with her characteristic deliberation, "and if you don't mind my saying so, to inquire after Mr. Blackwood's condition. Dreadful business, all of this." "Dreadful, indeed," Mrs. Watkins agreed. She began wrapping a tin of biscuits that Miss Marple had selected, though Miss Marple had made no indication of purchasing anything. "Dr. Ashford was here until quite late last night. He's called in a specialist, a toxicologist, I believe, from the city. The police have taken statements from everyone involved." "And have they concluded anything?" Miss Marple asked. She had moved to the section of shelves where various grocery items were kept: tea, coffee, sugar, and various provisions. It seems such a mysterious business. How does one poison someone without one imagines their knowledge? Mrs. Blackwood, the second Mrs. Blackwood I mean, brought him tea at approximately 2:30, Mrs. Watkins said. She lowered her voice, though the shop was otherwise empty save for themselves. He'd been doing the accounts, you see. He always had a cup of tea mid-afternoon. She brought it up to the flat and he drank it. Within an hour, he was ill. And where was Mrs. Blackwood at that time? Miss Marple asked gently. Upstairs with him, or tending to the shop? That's the curious part, Mrs. Watkins said. She was downstairs for a few moments, helping me with a customer. And Mrs. Thorpe came in looking for some ribbon. Mrs. Blackwood showed her what we had in stock. We'd just received a shipment of haberdashery, you see. They were discussing colour and width for perhaps 10 minutes, I'd say. Then Mrs. Blackwood went upstairs to bring Mr. Blackwood his tea. This was interesting, Miss Marple thought. A customer could corroborate or contradict this version of events. And the fact that Margot had been in the shop, in the sight of witnesses, for the period immediately preceding the poisoning was certainly suggestive of innocence. Unless, of course, the poison had been added to the tea itself before she brought it upstairs. But how would one poison a cup of tea in front of a witness without that witness noticing? I suppose the police will want to speak with this Mrs. Thorpe, Miss Marple suggested. They already have, or so I understand. She confirmed that Mrs. Blackwood was indeed downstairs, helping with the selection of ribbon. So that seems to clear Mrs. Blackwood of at least the direct administration of the poison. Miss Marple moved toward the counter, where she selected a small jar of marmalade and a packet of tea. You've been with Mr. Blackwood a long time, Mrs. Watkins. 17 years, I believe. Nearly 18 now, Mrs. Watkins said, ringing up the items. He gave me an opportunity when no one else would. My husband had only recently abandoned me, and I had 2 children to feed. Mr. Blackwood hired me despite my circumstances, and I have always been grateful to him. He could be difficult, he had his moods, and he could be exacting in his standards, but he was fair in his pay, and he never dismissed me, even during the war years, when business was uncertain. There was genuine affection in her voice, Miss Marple observed. This was not a woman without feeling for her employer. Yet genuine affection could coexist with other more complex emotions. Loyalty and resentment were not necessarily opposites. And his current wife? Miss Marple asked, keeping her voice light and casual. How do you find her? Mrs. Watkins's expression became careful. Mrs. Blackwood is pleasant enough. She doesn't involve herself much in the shop. She has her own interests, the ladies' circle, committee work, that sort of thing. I don't imagine she's particularly interested in commerce, but she seems devoted to Mr. Blackwood, and he is clearly infatuated with her. I suppose that's what matters in a marriage. The word infatuated was interesting. Miss Marple filed it away. By midday, Miss Marple had visited 3 other locations relevant to the case. She had taken tea with the vicar's wife and asked with apparent casualness about the marriages of the village. She had called upon the doctor's nurse and inquired with great sympathy about the symptoms of strychnine poisoning. And she had walked past the small cottage where Eleanor Blackwood lived, and observed through the front window that Eleanor was seated at her writing desk, her face composed and her hands steady as she wrote, seemingly unaffected by the turmoil that had consumed the village. It was late afternoon when the news came that would reshape the entire situation. Henry Blackwood had suffered a setback. The specialist from the city had arrived and had determined that the dose of strychnine was larger than initially suspected. The probability was that Henry Blackwood would not recover. The village reacted to this news with the particular intensity that small communities reserve for mortality. The ladies' circle gathered in the church to pray. The butcher, the grocer in the next town over, and the proprietor of the public house all expressed shock and dismay. And, inevitably, the question moved from who would poison Henry Blackwood to did someone poison Henry Blackwood with the intention of ending his life? This was, Miss Marple reflected, an important distinction. The death of Henry Blackwood occurred at 7:15 on the evening of the day of the poisoning. He had been in considerable pain throughout, despite the medication administered by the specialist, and his final words delivered to no one in particular were, I don't understand how this happened." It was a statement that Miss Marple thought could be interpreted in any number of ways. The police investigation began in earnest the following morning. Constable Barnes was joined by Detective Inspector Lamb from the city, a man of approximately 45 years, with the careful, methodical manner of someone who had learned not to trust his first impressions. He established himself in the village hall, with the vicar's permission, and began taking formal statements from everyone who might be considered relevant to the case. Miss Marple, observing the comings and goings with her customary discretion, noticed that the inspector's investigation seemed to be moving with remarkable certainty toward a single conclusion. Margot Blackwood had poisoned her husband, and she had done so with deliberate intent. The evidence, as Miss Marple understood it, was largely circumstantial, but nonetheless suggestive. Margot had access to the poison, or at least access to the victim's food and drink. She had been present in the flat when the poisoning occurred. She stood to inherit the shop and the flat, and possibly a modest sum of money that Henry Blackwood had accumulated over the years. She was young, and Henry was considerably older, and such a combination had been the genesis of more than one criminal affair in the pages of the newspapers and the annals of village gossip. Moreover, as Mrs. Watkins had said, Henry was infatuated with her. It was possible that his infatuation was waning, or that Margot had found another object of her affection. In village affairs, passion and greed were often intertwined in inextricable knots. Yet Miss Marple, who had spent more than 8 decades observing human nature with the careful attention of a naturalist studying an exotic species, found herself unconvinced. There were too many elements that did not align properly. Too many details that suggested something other than what appeared on the surface. It was on the 3rd day following Henry's death that Miss Marple received a visitor. She had been in her garden, tending to her roses with the devotion of a woman for whom gardening represented both art and meditation. Eleanor Blackwood appeared at the garden gate, dressed in black, her face composed but her eyes carrying the particular strain of someone bearing a burden they were determined to conceal. "Miss Marple," Eleanor said, "I wondered if I might speak with you, in private." Miss Marple set down her pruning shears and regarded Eleanor with the gentle attention she reserved for those in genuine distress. "Of course, dear. Shall we sit on the bench? The afternoon is quite pleasant, and the roses are at their best." They seated themselves on a wooden bench positioned to face the garden. For a long moment, Eleanor did not speak. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the middle distance, and Miss Marple sensed that the younger woman was engaged in an internal struggle of considerable proportion. They believe Margot poisoned Henry, Eleanor finally said. The inspector seems quite convinced. He has asked me about my movements on the day of the poisoning, about my feelings toward Henry, about whether I believed Margot to be capable of such a thing. And what did you tell him? Miss Marple asked gently. I told him the truth, Eleanor said, that I do not know whether Margot is capable of such a thing, that I was at home that afternoon, alone, and that I have no witnesses to corroborate this, that I harbour no particular animosity toward Henry, despite our separation and divorce. She paused. I also told him that I do not believe Margot is guilty. This was rather extraordinary, Miss Marple thought. Here was a woman whose husband had divorced her to marry another, and whose financial situation was considerably diminished as a result, declaring the rival's innocence. It suggested either great nobility of spirit or great knowledge of the truth. Why do you believe that? Miss Marple asked. Eleanor's hands tightened slightly. Because I knew Henry. I knew him for 22 years, and despite everything that has occurred between us, I understand his nature. And because I watched Margot's face when she realized Henry was truly ill, truly critically ill. She was frightened, genuinely frightened. Not the fear of someone whose plan was succeeding, but the fear of someone confronted with a consequence they had not anticipated. People are complex creatures, Miss Marple observed, and emotion is not always transparent even to those who believe themselves to be keen observers. I know, Eleanor said, but I also know that Margot cared for Henry in her way. Not in the way I cared for him. I cared for the man he was when we married, and for the father of my children, and for the companion he became through the years. But she cared for him. I saw it in how she adjusted his pillow, in how she made certain he had his meals prepared just the way he preferred them, in how she laughed at his jokes even when they were not funny. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. Then she said, If Miss Blackwood did not poison your former husband, then someone else must have. Have you any thoughts on who that might be? Eleanor's face became guarded. I have my thoughts, yes, but I am not a detective, Miss Marple. I am simply a woman who cares about justice and who is afraid that the easiest solution will become the accepted one, and that an innocent person will be condemned. What do you know? Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle but direct. Eleanor stood abruptly. I should not have come. I have already said too much. But I wanted you to know, Miss Marple, that there are depths to this matter that the police investigation does not seem inclined to explore. Depths that perhaps only someone with your understanding might uncover. She left before Miss Marple could respond, departing through the garden gate with a swiftness that suggested emotion held carefully in check. Miss Marple watched her go, and then returned to her roses, her mind occupied with the question that Eleanor's visit had raised. What did Eleanor Blackwood know that she was not telling the police? The problem with murder investigations, Miss Marple had long ago observed, was that they tended to organize themselves around the shape of a theory, rather than around the shape of the truth. Detective Inspector Lamb had constructed a theory. Margot Blackwood, young wife of an older man, had poisoned her husband in hopes of inheriting his modest fortune and gaining her freedom. The evidence seemed to support this theory, or at least not to contradict it. Therefore, the investigation proceeded along the lines suggested by the theory, and evidence was gathered to support it. What was not being investigated was the possibility that someone else had poisoned Henry Blackwood, or that the poisoning itself had been a form of accident, or that there had been some other motive entirely unrelated to greed or passion or the desire for freedom. What was not being considered was the curious detail that Miss Marple had noticed on her third visit to the corner shop. A small notebook, hidden on a high shelf in the stockroom, which appeared to contain records of Henry's private transactions, records that seemed to indicate he had been lending money to various people in the village, at what appeared to be considerably above market rates of interest. It was on the afternoon of the fourth day following the death that Miss Marple made her way to the village library and requested to see the local newspapers from the previous 5 years. Mrs. Pemberton, the librarian, was a woman of considerable organizational ability and minimal curiosity about the reasons for research requests. She produced the newspapers without comment, and Miss Marple spent 2 hours moving through them with careful attention, noting dates and names and details of arrests, convictions, financial transactions, and scandals. What emerged from this research was a picture of a village not entirely unlike her own village of St. Mary Mead, but with its own particular currents of financial distress, personal desperation, and carefully concealed resentment. David Pearson, the young man who worked as an assistant in Henry's shop, had been cited in a bankruptcy notice 2 years previously. His family had lost their farm, and he had come to work at the shop, beneath the station to which his birth and education entitled him, but at wages that allowed him to support his aging mother, who lived in a cottage on the edge of the village. Mrs. Briar Watkins had received an inheritance 8 years previously, a modest sum left to her by a distant cousin. The newspaper had reported this fact in its social column. 2 years after this inheritance, Mrs. Watkins's daughter had married, and the wedding had been held in the city, suggesting considerable expense. The Reverend Collins had raised funds for the roof of the church 5 years previously, a campaign that had brought the financial struggles of the parish into rather public relief. Eleanor Blackwood had purchased her cottage, the cottage where she now lived, 3 years previously, and the price paid had been recorded in the local conveyancing notice at somewhat below market value, suggesting financial difficulty on the part of the seller. And Henry Blackwood, during this same period, had accumulated considerable wealth. Not vast wealth, but considerable wealth. For a man who operated a corner shop in a village of fewer than 2,000 souls. Miss Marple closed the newspapers and thanked Mrs. Pemberton quietly. She left the library and made her way home, her mind occupied with the architecture of motive and opportunity that was slowly revealing itself beneath the surface of village life. The arrest of Margot Blackwood occurred on the 5th day following Henry's death. Detective Inspector Lamb had gathered sufficient circumstantial evidence to secure a warrant, and Margot had been taken into custody at the police station in the city, where she would remain pending trial for the murder of her husband. The village reaction to the arrest was, if not unanimous, then certainly overwhelmingly in one direction. The sympathy that had wavered when Margot first appeared in the village, sympathy for a woman married to a much older man, sympathy that was quickly overwhelmed by the disapproval of her being homewrecker, had been entirely replaced by conviction of her guilt. She poisoned him for the money, Mrs. Bantry pronounced with finality at the church auxiliary meeting, a statement that was met with general murmurs of agreement. These young women, they marry men old enough to be their fathers and then grow impatient with the wait for the inheritance. Dreadful girl, agreed the wife of the schoolmaster. I never trusted her. There was always something calculating in her manner. Poor Eleanor, sighed Mrs. Whitmore. At least she has the satisfaction of knowing that justice has been done. Though, of course, the scandal remains. Miss Marple, sitting quietly at the edge of the group, offered neither agreement nor contradiction. She had not attended the arrest herself. Such dramatic scenes had never appealed to her. But she had learned the details from Constable Barnes, who had called upon her the morning after, ostensibly to inquire after her health, but in reality, to discuss the case. "It seems straightforward enough," Constable Barnes had said, sitting somewhat uncomfortably in Miss Marple's parlour while she poured tea. She had access to the poison, she had motive, and she had opportunity. The inspector seems quite satisfied that the case is solved. "And how was the poison administered?" Miss Marple asked. "I confess I have not entirely understood this detail." "That's where it becomes somewhat uncertain," Constable Barnes admitted. "The cup itself was rinsed by Mrs. Blackwood, so there's no physical evidence from that source. But it's believed she placed the poison in the tea itself just before bringing it to Mr. Blackwood. Or perhaps she had already poisoned the tea before leaving the flat and went downstairs simply to establish an alibi." "But Mrs. Thorpe corroborated her presence in the shop during the crucial time, did she not?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Yes, she did, but that doesn't necessarily mean much. The poison could have been added earlier, or there could be some misunderstanding about timing. The inspector believes that while Mrs. Blackwood was downstairs, she had an opportunity to go back upstairs for a moment without being observed. The connecting door between the flat and the shop is not visible from the main counter." Miss Marple considered this, sipping her tea with apparent thoughtfulness. "And what of the other residents of the village? Have they been questioned?" "Thoroughly," Constable Barnes assured her. "Eleanor Blackwood has an alibi of sorts. She was at home, though no one can confirm her presence. David Pearson was at the shop the entire afternoon, and Mrs. Watkins was also present, both in the shop and upstairs at various points. The Reverend was at the church, and so on. No one else had any obvious motive or opportunity." "And you are satisfied with the inspector's conclusions?" Miss Marple asked. Constable Barnes hesitated. "I believe the evidence points toward Mrs. Blackwood," he said carefully. "Whether I would say that I am entirely satisfied, well, that is perhaps a matter of degree. But the inspector is an experienced man, and he seems confident in his assessment." It was on the 8th day following Henry's death that Miss Marple made an important observation. She had been walking through the village in the late afternoon, making her customary rounds, calling upon the vicar's wife, visiting the post office, purchasing provisions, when she passed the corner shop and noted something that had escaped her attention previously. The shop had been closed since Henry's death, but on this day, David Pearson was visible through the window, arranging stock on the shelves. It was unusual to see the shop in operation without either Henry or Margot, and Miss Marple paused on the pavement, ostensibly to adjust her walking stick, while in fact observing David's movements with considerable attention. David Pearson was a young man of approximately 30 years, with the somewhat defeated appearance of someone whose life had not proceeded according to his expectations. He came from what had been a substantial farming family, but the farm had been lost to bad management and worse luck some 8 years previously. He had gone to university, Oxford, Miss Marple believed, and had studied modern languages, a field in which he had been considered quite accomplished. Yet circumstances had forced him to return to his village and accept work in the corner shop, work that was considerably beneath his intellectual capacity and his social station. He was also, Miss Marple knew from a conversation with Mrs. Watkins, in love with Patricia Denham, the daughter of the village doctor's neighbour. Patricia was a pleasant young woman, but she came from a family of considerable property, and young David Pearson, with his social position diminished and his financial prospects uncertain, was regarded by Patricia's mother as an unsuitable match. This was not the first time Miss Marple had observed the particular desperation that came from loving someone one could not hope to attain. It was a desperation that could lead to many things, both foolish and occasionally criminal. David Pearson finished arranging his stock and looked toward the door of the shop, as though considering whether to open it. Then he seemed to think better of it, and instead disappeared into the back of the shop, toward the stockroom and the stairs that led upstairs to the flat. Miss Marple continued her walk, but her mind was now occupied with a question that she had not previously considered. What was David Pearson doing in the shop on a day when it was closed and his employer was dead and his employer's wife was in custody awaiting trial? The answer seemed obvious. He was attending to some business related to the estate, or the shop, or some other practical matter. Yet it was curious that neither Constable Barnes nor Detective Inspector Lamb had mentioned this. Curious, too, that Mrs. Watkins had not been mentioned as being present. When Miss Marple arrived at the police station that evening, ostensibly to provide some information to Constable Barnes about the arrangements for the church auxiliary meeting, she had occasion to inquire about the details of the shop's management in the wake of Henry's death. "Who is attending to the business matters?" she asked. "The shop is closed naturally, but there are goods that must be managed, and bills that must be paid, and employees who must be informed of their situation." "The solicitor is managing that," Constable Barnes said. "Henry's will has been probated, and his nephew, that would be his brother's son, Stephen Blackwood, will be inheriting the shop and the flat. Stephen lives in the city and works in insurance. He's indicated that he intends to sell the shop rather than maintain it, so the current staff will likely be out of employment." "How unfortunate," Miss Marple said. "And in the meantime, who has authority to manage the day-to-day business?" "I believe the solicitor has given permission to David Pearson to arrange certain matters, clearing out stock that will spoil, that sort of thing." "Why do you ask?" "Idle curiosity," Miss Marple said. "I observed David Pearson in the shop earlier today, which surprised me given that the shop remains closed. I merely wondered if some business had been transacted that required his presence." "That seems reasonable enough," Constable Barnes said. "The young man has been with Henry for some years, and he would naturally have an interest in ensuring that the goods don't spoil before they can be sold or distributed." Yet Miss Marple left the police station with something that Constable Barnes's answer had not quite explained. A persistent sense that there was more to David Pearson's presence in the shop than the simple management of stock. The next morning, Miss Marple made an appointment with the solicitor, a gentleman named Mr. Pettigrew, who maintained offices in the town 3 miles distant. She presented herself to his secretary with the air of a woman of considerable age who wished to update her will, and she was received with appropriate courtesy. Mr. Pettigrew was a man of approximately 60 years, with the careful manners of someone who made his living managing the financial and legal affairs of others. He greeted Miss Marple with warmth. She had been a client of his firm for many years, and seated her in his office with tea. "I understand that you are managing the affairs of the late Henry Blackwood," Miss Marple said, once she had settled herself appropriately. "Difficult business, naturally. A murder in one's own village is always disturbing." "Quite so," Mr. Pettigrew agreed. "A dreadful affair." I have known Henry since I was a young man practicing law. My father was his solicitor before me. A difficult man, I confess, but not without redeeming qualities." "I wondered," Miss Marple said, lowering her voice in that manner that tends to encourage confidentiality, "whether you might perhaps tell me something about Henry's will and his financial affairs. I do not ask out of mere gossip, you understand. I have a reason for asking." Mr. Pettigrew hesitated. The solicitor-client privilege and the confidentiality of the dead were real considerations. Yet Miss Marple had a reputation, and Mr. Pettigrew had more than once been impressed by her observations. "I suppose there is little harm in discussing the general outlines of the matter," he said carefully. "Henry's estate is modest, as you might expect for a man who operated a shop. His will leaves the shop and the flat to his nephew, Stephen. There is a small monetary bequest to Eleanor, £500, which suggests that despite their divorce, he maintained some regard for her, and his personal effects are disposed of in the usual manner." "And his financial records?" Miss Marple asked. "I imagine a man who operated a shop for as many years as Henry did would maintain somewhat detailed records of his business and his personal finances?" "Naturally. The records are with the shop itself. The flat above contains Henry's personal papers, and the shop itself contains the business records. Why do you ask?" "I'm curious," Miss Marple said, "about the extent of Henry's wealth. Mrs. Watkins mentioned that he had made several loans to people in the village. Has the solicitor reviewed these matters?" "It seems to me that loans at interest represent a different form of wealth accumulation than the straightforward operation of a shop." Mr. Pettigrew's expression became somewhat guarded. "There are indeed some personal loans recorded in Henry's papers. I confess I have not examined them in detail, as they are not directly relevant to the estate. Why do you ask?" "Because I think it possible," Miss Marple said slowly, "that Henry's murder may be connected not to his marriage or his wealth, but to these loans. I think it possible that someone owed Henry money, and that this debt may have represented a considerable burden to them. And I think it possible that the police investigation has not explored this avenue, because the investigation has been conducted along other lines." Mr. Pettigrew was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I cannot provide you with the details of Henry's personal finances. That would be inappropriate. However, I can tell you that the loans you mention are a matter of record that will eventually become public through the probate process. And I can tell you that there were indeed several loans of substantial size made to residents of the village. If you believe these loans are relevant to Henry's death, then I would suggest you make your observations known to the police." "I shall do so," Miss Marple promised, "but first I wish to conduct some observations of my own." The next day, Miss Marple began a systematic process of what she termed village consultation, a process that involved calling upon various residents and engaging them in apparently casual conversation that was designed to elicit information about Henry's financial arrangements. She called upon Mrs. Watkins and inquired gently about whether Henry had ever mentioned lending money to various people in the village. Mrs. Watkins, caught off guard by the question, confirmed that Henry had indeed done so, adding that she thought it was quite generous of him to help people in financial difficulty. "And to whom did he lend money?" Miss Marple asked innocently. "I'm not certain," Mrs. Watkins said. "These were private transactions, you understand. But I know he helped David Pearson's mother with some medical expenses. She had a dreadful operation some years back, and the doctor's fees were quite steep. And I believe he made a loan to the Reverend for the church roof repair. and perhaps to the Denhams, though I am not certain about that. The Denhams. This was interesting, Miss Marple thought. Patricia's father was a doctor, a man of considerable standing in the village, yet apparently he had been sufficiently in financial difficulty to require a loan from Henry Blackwood. She next called upon the Reverend Collins and inquired about the church roof repair, during which she managed to elicit the information that the Reverend had indeed borrowed money from Henry for the repair, and that the loan had been at an interest rate of 5%, which the Reverend described as generous, all things considered. "And have you repaid this loan?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I am endeavouring to do so," the Reverend said. "It is a slow process, I confess. The parish's finances are not robust, and I have had to prioritise the loan repayment along with other obligations. Henry was patient, generally speaking, though I sensed in recent months that he was becoming impatient with my pace of repayment." Interesting, Miss Marple thought. Financial pressure could take many forms. She did not call directly upon the Denhams. That would have been too obvious. But she did manage to encounter Dr. Denham at the post office, where she engaged him in conversation about the recent weather and the unfortunate death of Henry Blackwood. And in the course of this conversation, she inquired whether he had known Henry well. "Well enough," Dr. Denham said, his manner somewhat defensive. "We were not intimate friends, but we were acquainted as one is in a village." "I imagine you were both of an age to have shared certain experiences," Miss Marple said, "and perhaps certain financial troubles from time to time." Dr. Denham's face became quite stiff. "I am not certain what you mean," he said coldly, and he departed the post office rather more quickly than his original business would have required. Yet Miss Marple had seen the confirmation she sought in his reaction. Dr. Denham had indeed borrowed money from Henry Blackwood, and the fact that he had reacted so defensively to the question suggested that the matter remained a source of considerable discomfort. It was on the 12th day following Henry's death that Miss Marple requested an appointment with Detective Inspector Lamb. The inspector had returned to the village to arrange certain final details of the case against Margot Blackwood, and he had established himself once again in the village hall. When Miss Marple appeared at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, with her walking stick and her handbag, and her air of advanced age and innocent inquiry, the inspector received her with the courtesy that is typically extended to elderly women of apparent respectability. "Miss Marple," he said, standing as she entered, "I trust you are well. This has been a dreadful affair for the village, I imagine." "Most dreadful," Miss Marple agreed, settling herself in the chair he offered. "I have come to speak with you because I believe there is a detail in the case that you may not have fully explored." Inspector Lamb's expression became wary. In his experience, elderly women who believed they had identified details in murder cases were usually wrong, and yet occasionally they were possessed of observations that turned out to be relevant. He listened as Miss Marple began to explain about Henry's loans and about the financial distress of various villagers, and about the possibility that the motive for Henry's murder might not be connected to Margot at all, but rather to the debts that Henry had accumulated. "You believe that someone murdered Mr. Blackwood in order to avoid repayment of a loan?" Inspector Lamb asked, his tone suggesting considerable skepticism. "I believe it is a possibility that warrants investigation," Miss Marple said. "I do not claim to know the truth. I am merely an observer of human nature, Inspector. But I have observed that financial desperation can drive people to remarkable actions. And I have observed that there are several people in this village who had substantial loans outstanding to Mr. Blackwood, and who may have had both motive and potentially opportunity. Motive, perhaps, Inspector Lamb said, but opportunity is more difficult. These people would have had to gain access to the poison, administer it without detection, and create an alibi for themselves. Mrs. Blackwood had all of these things. She had access to everything, she was present in the flat, and she had the motive of inheritance and freedom from a marriage she apparently found unsatisfactory. Did she indeed have access to poison? Miss Marple asked gently. Or do we simply assume that she did, because she had access to the flat and to her husband's food and drink? The poison itself, strychnine, is not commonly kept in private homes, is it? It is more typically found in agricultural or chemical applications. We have not yet determined where the poison originated, Inspector Lamb admitted, but it is not difficult to obtain, and Mrs. Blackwood had several days between Henry's return from the tea party and the actual poisoning to acquire it. And yet, she brought her husband tea in front of a witness, Miss Marple said. Surely, if she intended to poison him, she would have chosen a moment when her actions could not be observed. She established herself downstairs to create an alibi, Inspector Lamb said, but Miss Marple detected a note of uncertainty in his voice. It is a classic device. Establish witnesses to one's innocence of the direct act, then administer the poison later in the day. Yet she was observed in the shop by Mrs. Thorpe, Miss Marple said, and Mrs. Thorpe could corroborate the time of her presence, could she not? Mrs. Thorpe's memory of the exact time is not as precise as one might wish, Inspector Lamb said. She recalls that Mrs. Blackwood helped her select ribbon, but she could not specify whether this occurred at 2 o'clock or 2:30, or even 3 o'clock. The human memory is often unreliable in such matters. This was true, Miss Marple acknowledged silently. Yet it remained suspicious that the case had been constructed in such a way as to make every detail, no matter how uncertain, fall into place to support the conclusion of Margot's guilt. I would like to pose a different theory, Miss Marple said carefully. What if the poison was not administered by Mrs. Blackwood at all, but by someone else? Someone who had access to the flat, who had access to Henry's food or drink, and who had either a financial motive, the elimination of a debt, or some other motive that has not yet been adequately explored. And who might this person be? Inspector Lamb asked. We have thoroughly investigated everyone with access to the flat or the shop. No one else had motive or opportunity. I would suggest, Miss Marple said, that David Pearson had both motive and opportunity. His family lost their farm to financial difficulties, and his mother required expensive medical treatment. Henry Blackwood made a loan to cover these expenses, and if that loan has become an unbearable burden, then Mr. Pearson had motive. As for opportunity, he was in the shop that afternoon. He could have accessed the flat through the connecting door, and he would have known his employer's habits, his routine of taking tea at a specific time. Have you evidence of this? Inspector Lamb asked. I have only observation, Miss Marple said. But I would suggest that it would be worth investigating whether David Pearson has had unusual financial movements, or whether he was aware that his debt might be forgiven if Henry were no longer available to press for repayment. I would also suggest investigating the source of the poison itself. If poison has been purchased by anyone in the village in the months preceding the death, that would be relevant information. Inspector Lamb was quiet, considering. Then he said, I appreciate your observations, Miss Marple. However, I must tell you that the case against Mrs. Blackwood is quite strong, and I am confident in the conclusions that have been drawn. Unless you have evidence, not theory, but evidence that suggests someone else is guilty, I must advise you not to pursue this line of inquiry further. you may find yourself in the awkward position of hindering rather than helping the course of justice. It was a dismissal, though a courteous one. Miss Marple rose from her chair, gathered her things and thanked the inspector for his time. Yet, as she left the village hall, she did not abandon her inquiry. If anything, the inspector's certainty served only to strengthen her conviction that there was something being overlooked. Some detail, some clue that would illuminate the truth if only one could see it from the proper angle. The important clue came that evening quite by accident. Miss Marple had been sorting through her correspondence when she found, tucked between two letters, a small newspaper cutting that Mrs. Bartlett, the milkwoman, had mentioned she was leaving for her attention. It was a notice from the city newspaper, published some 6 months previously, concerning the sale of a large farm estate in the county. The article mentioned that the estate had been acquired by a new owner, a gentleman named Harold Crescent, who had made his fortune in cotton importing, and who had recently retired to the countryside. There was a photograph accompanying the article. Miss Marple studied it carefully, and in particular, she studied the face of the man standing beside Harold Crescent in the photograph. A younger man, introduced as Harold Crescent's personal secretary and assistant in the management of the estate. The younger man's face was familiar to Miss Marple. She had seen it before, though not in the context she was now considering. She went to her bureau and withdrew the village directory, a document that was updated annually, and which listed the residents of Little Hartleton and surrounding areas. She consulted the business section and found the entry she sought: Blackwood, Henry, corner shop, High Street proprietor. But she also found something else, something that she had not previously paid particular attention to. Blackwood, Stephen, absent from village, employed in insurance, city, Henry's nephew. The nephew who was inheriting the shop and the flat. The nephew who lived in the city and worked in insurance. Miss Marple rose from her desk and went to the telephone. She asked the operator for the number of the police station, and when Constable Barnes answered, she asked if he could provide her with a description of Stephen Blackwood, who was expected to claim his inheritance. "I'm not certain I have such a description," Constable Barnes said, sounding confused by the request. "Why do you ask?" "I believe I may have seen a photograph of Mr. Stephen Blackwood in a newspaper article," Miss Marple explained. "And I wish to confirm whether it is the same person. Can you provide me with any information about his appearance, his age, his colouring, any distinguishing characteristics?" There was a pause. Then Constable Barnes said, "I can have the solicitor provide such a description if necessary. But might I ask why this is relevant?" "I shall explain when I know more," Miss Marple said. "For now, I would appreciate any information that can be obtained quickly." She waited, and after perhaps 10 minutes, Constable Barnes called back with the information he had obtained from Mr. Pettigrew. Stephen Blackwood was 41 years of age, of medium height, with dark hair greying at the temples and a scar above his left eye from an old injury. He had been absent from the village for more than 15 years and was known to work in insurance in the city. A scar above the left eye. Miss Marple turned the newspaper photograph to the light and examined it more carefully. Yes, there it was, a thin line, a scar, visible in the photograph, though difficult to see at a first casual glance. She knew then that she had found something significant. But what it signified, she could not yet determine. The inquiry that Miss Marple began the following morning was subtle, indirect, and conducted with the appearance of idle curiosity. She asked the vicar whether he had ever met Henry's nephew Stephen. She inquired of the postmaster whether any unusual parcels or mail had been delivered to Henry's address from the city. She engaged Mrs. Watkins in conversation about Henry's family. Did he have siblings? What had become of them? The picture that emerged was fragmentary but suggestive. Henry had had a brother Thomas, who had died some 25 years previously. Thomas had had a son, Stephen, who had been raised by his mother and who had grown distant from the family after his father's death. There had been, Mrs. Watkins vaguely recalled, some sort of difficulty between Henry and his brother over family business matters. But the details had been forgotten or never known to her. Yet it was precisely this sort of long-buried family conflict that Miss Marple had learned to regard with considerable attention. Such conflicts did not fade with time. Rather, they festered and transformed into something harder and more dangerous. She made the decision then to take an action that was perhaps somewhat outside the bounds of what an elderly spinster of her position typically undertook. She wrote a letter to Mr. Pettigrew, requesting that he provide her with any information he might have regarding the relationship between Henry and his late brother Thomas, and regarding the circumstances under which Stephen had removed himself from the village. Mr. Pettigrew's response came by return post the following day. It was cautious and carefully worded, but it provided Miss Marple with exactly the information she required. Thomas Blackwood had died under somewhat questionable circumstances. A riding accident, the official report concluded, though there had been at the time some whisper of a dispute between Thomas and Henry regarding the family farm. The farm had, after Thomas's death, passed to Henry, and Henry had subsequently sold it. The proceeds from this sale had provided much of the capital from which Henry had established his corner shop. Stephen, the son of Thomas, had been a young man of 16 at the time of his father's death. There had been a dispute about the inheritance. Thomas's wife claimed that Thomas had intended the farm to pass to Stephen, but Henry had inherited it, and Henry had sold it. Some legal action had been threatened, but ultimately nothing had come of it. Stephen had departed the village and had made a deliberate effort to distance himself from his uncle. This was the sort of injury that festered, Miss Marple thought. A young man robbed of his inheritance, a family tragedy transformed into a financial loss, a long-harboured resentment against an uncle who had benefited from the misfortune. But did this provide Stephen with motive? Potentially, yes. The farm had been sold more than 20 years previously, but resentment did not have an expiration date. And perhaps Miss Marple considered this possibility with careful attention. Stephen had been waiting for an opportunity. Henry was older now, less vigorous. Henry's will left him the shop, a modest fortune perhaps, but more importantly, it left him in a position of increased importance and control. Perhaps Stephen had been waiting for the right moment to strike. Yet this was all theory, all speculation based on past history. Miss Marple needed evidence. The evidence came quite suddenly from an unexpected source. It was on the afternoon of the 15th day that David Pearson came to Miss Marple's cottage and asked to speak with her in private. He was agitated, his usual manner of careful politeness displaced by something that resembled desperation. Miss Marple received him in her sitting room and offered him tea, which he accepted with trembling hands. "I have done something foolish," he began without preamble, "something that I have only come to understand the implications of in recent days. I came to you, Miss Marple. because I believe you are a woman of discretion and judgment, and because I do not know what else to do." "Tell me," Miss Marple said gently. "I have been in debt to Mr. Blackwood for several years," David said. "A substantial debt, incurred to pay for my mother's medical treatment. The debt has been a burden on me, a weight that I have carried constantly. I have worked in his shop not merely for employment, but as a way of gradually reducing the debt through small payments and deductions from my wages." "That must have been difficult," Miss Marple observed. "It was. But Mr. Blackwood was patient enough. He knew my circumstances. He knew that I was unable to pay all at once, and he was willing to permit me to work my way through the debt. At least, he was willing until recently." David paused, collecting himself. In recent months, his patience seemed to wear thin. He began pressing me about the outstanding balance, hinting that I must pay it all at once, or face consequences. He spoke of taking legal action, of attaching my wages if necessary. He became difficult. "And when did this change occur?" Miss Marple asked. "Approximately 3 months ago. That was when I first noticed the change in his demeanor. He had never been warm, but he became cold, almost vengeful. I did not understand the cause of the change, but I knew that my position had become precarious." "I see," Miss Marple said. "And how does this relate to his death?" David took a shaky breath. "That is what I came to tell you. A few days before his death, Mr. Blackwood called me into his office, the back room of the shop. He said he wanted to discuss the matter of the outstanding debt. I went in, and I found him sitting at his desk with a ledger open before him. He was showing me the various debts that he had outstanding, not just mine, but others. He had a rather grim expression, and he said something that I found to be quite odd." "What did he say?" Miss Marple asked. "He said, 'David, I have come to the realization that I have been too generous with people. I have made loans that I should never have made, and now I am going to have to be more strict about collection. But there is one debt that particularly concerns me, and I believe it may be one that will give me considerable leverage over someone.'" Miss Marple's mind sharpened. Did he specify which debt this was? He did not name the person at first, but then he said, "I have evidence that would be quite damaging to someone if it were to become public. And I believe that person will be willing to pay considerable money to keep that evidence private." I asked him what he meant, but he would not elaborate. He simply sent me back to work. "And you have no idea which debt he was referring to?" Miss Marple asked. "I did not at the time," David said. "But I have since become convinced that it was the debt owed by Dr. Denham. Dr. Denham came to the shop that afternoon, the afternoon that Mr. Blackwood died, and he looked absolutely terrified. He came in and purchased a few items, but he kept looking toward the back room, toward where Mr. Blackwood was working on the accounts, and his hands were shaking." Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her pale eyes thoughtful. "Why have you come to tell me this, David? Why not go to the police?" "Because I am afraid," David said simply. "I am afraid that if I tell them this, they will investigate me more closely, and they will discover something that will make my own position more precarious. And because I came to realize something." "What did you realize?" Miss Marple asked. "I realized that the poison might not have been intended for Mr. Blackwood at all. I realized that someone might have put the poison in the tea, believing it was meant for someone else. Someone like me." The silence that followed this revelation was quite complete. "Explain," Miss Marple said after a moment. "Mr. Blackwood often made tea in the flat mid-afternoon," David said, "and sometimes when I was working late in the shop, which I often was, doing the accounts or arranging stock, he would bring a cup down to me. It was a small gesture of, well, not kindness exactly, but perhaps acknowledgement that I was working late on his behalf. And several times in the weeks before his death, someone asked me about this routine. Someone asked when Mr. Blackwood usually took his tea, and whether I ever had some as well. "Who asked you?" Miss Marple said sharply. "I do not know for certain," David said. "It came up in casual conversation, I believe. But thinking back, I wonder if it was Dr. Denham who asked, or perhaps someone who knew Dr. Denham well. I wonder if someone believed that I might have been the target, and that if I were removed, if my debt were removed by my death, then Dr. Denham's own debt might be forgotten more easily." This was a fascinating theory, Miss Marple thought, and it opened up entirely new possibilities in the case. Yet it was also, she considered carefully, quite possibly a false theory constructed by an anxious mind seeking to explain a frightening situation. "I am grateful that you have come to me," Miss Marple said, "and I would strongly advise you to consider telling the police what you have just told me. There is nothing in what you have said that incriminates you, and it may provide them with evidence that is relevant to their investigation." "But Mrs. Blackwood is already in custody," David said. "Will it not look odd if I suddenly come forward with information that seems to suggest someone else might be guilty?" "It may look odd," Miss Marple acknowledged, "but justice is not served by silence, no matter how awkward the truth may be." After David had departed, Miss Marple sat alone in her sitting room for a considerable time, her hands folded in her lap, her mind working through the various theories and possibilities that had presented themselves. A poison intended for someone other than Henry. Blackmail based on hidden evidence. A long-festered family grudge. A financial motive connected to Dr. Denham's debt. Each theory had merit. Each could potentially explain Henry's death. Yet which, if any, was true? And there remained the puzzling question of Stephen Blackwood, the nephew who appeared to be living a different life than he had represented to the village authorities. Who was this man with the scar above his left eye, working as a secretary to a wealthy farmer, rather than as an insurance agent in the city? Miss Marple rose from her chair and went to the window, where she stood looking out at the garden as the afternoon light began to fade. Somewhere in the village, the truth lay hidden behind layers of deception and self-interest. And somewhere in the village, the person who had poisoned Henry Blackwood was continuing their life as though nothing had occurred, secure in the belief that the wrong person had been blamed. This was the moment when Miss Marple typically felt the particular satisfaction that came from understanding something that others had overlooked. Yet this time, the satisfaction was tempered by a curious uncertainty. She thought she understood what had happened, but she could not prove it. And an innocent woman, or a guilty woman, depending on one's assessment of the facts, remained in custody, awaiting trial for a crime that the police believed she had committed. It was time, Miss Marple decided, to take direct action. The revelation that changed everything came not from Miss Marple's own investigation, but rather from an entirely unexpected source, the laboratory analysis of the poisoned cup. Detective Inspector Lamb had, out of thoroughness, if not out of conviction, sent the cup, which had been recovered and washed by Margot, but which had been carefully preserved after being removed from the kitchen, to a laboratory in the city for analysis. The laboratory technicians had been able to recover microscopic traces of strychnine from the interior of the cup, and in the course of their analysis, they had discovered something quite unexpected. The strychnine had not been applied to the cup itself, nor had it been present in the tea as a liquid or powder. Rather, it had been applied to the rim of the cup, the very portion of the cup that would touch the lips of the drinker when the cup was raised for consumption. This was an application method of considerable sophistication, suggesting knowledge of poison and its properties. More significantly, the pattern of the strychnine application suggested that it had been applied and allowed to dry completely before the cup had been used. This was not consistent with the theory that Margot had poisoned the cup just before bringing it to her husband. The poison would have required at least several hours to dry completely, perhaps longer depending on the humidity and temperature. This information was communicated to Detective Inspector Lamb on the 16th day following Henry's death, and it altered the trajectory of his investigation with remarkable swiftness. If the poison had been applied to the cup hours in advance, then the poisoner must have had access to the cup well before the afternoon of the poisoning. This opened up the possibility that someone other than Margot, someone who could have accessed the flat or the kitchen at an earlier time, might have been responsible. The inspector's sudden revision of his investigation was communicated to Miss Marple through Constable Barnes, who appeared at her cottage with a somewhat chagrined expression. "The inspector would like to speak with you," Constable Barnes said, not meeting her eyes. "He believes you may have been correct about there being other possible perpetrators. He wishes to discuss the matter of Henry's loans and the debts that various villagers owed to him." Miss Marple rose and gathered her things. "I shall come to the village hall immediately," she said, "and I suggest that the inspector also make inquiries regarding one Stephen Blackwood and regarding the nature of his relationship with his late uncle." When Miss Marple arrived at the village hall, she found that Detective Inspector Lamb had been busy. Dr. Denham was there, looking considerably apprehensive. David Pearson was waiting to give a formal statement, and several other residents of the village had been asked to provide information regarding their knowledge of the poisoning and their relationship with Henry Blackwood. It was in the midst of this activity that a new development occurred. A message arrived from the city, a telephone call from the police constable stationed there, conveying information that had come to light during a routine check of Henry Blackwood's financial records. The records indicated that Henry had been attempting to locate and contact someone named Stephen Crescent, a secretary employed by Harold Crescent, a gentleman farmer in the county. Upon investigation, it was determined that Stephen Crescent was, in fact, Stephen Blackwood, Henry's nephew, operating under an assumed name. More significantly, it was discovered that Stephen Blackwood had written to his uncle a letter discovered among Henry's papers, expressing a desire to meet and to discuss certain family matters of considerable importance. The letter was dated approximately 3 months prior to Henry's death. Henry had responded to this letter with a reply that was quite revealing. In the reply, Henry had suggested a meeting, but he had also indicated that he possessed information about Stephen's activities and circumstances that might be of considerable interest, and that he would be willing to keep this information confidential in exchange for a financial arrangement. In other words, Henry had been blackmailing his nephew. The revelation that Henry had been engaged in blackmail transformed the nature of the investigation entirely. Detective Inspector Lamb, his previous certainty thoroughly undermined, began asking questions with considerably more urgency and less certainty about what the answers might be. What was this information that Henry possessed? What had Stephen Blackwood done that would make him vulnerable to blackmail? The answer came, pieced together from various documents and interviews. into a picture of considerable complexity. Stephen Blackwood, it appeared, had not built a career in insurance as he had claimed. Rather, he had spent the past 25 years engaged in work that was considerably less respectable. He had been involved in various questionable financial schemes, some of which bordered on fraud. He had adopted the name Stephen Crescent to distance himself from his past, and he had built a new life as a secretary to a wealthy gentleman farmer, a position that afforded him comfort and security, but not wealth. When he had written to his uncle expressing a desire to meet, he had presumably been hoping for some kind of reconciliation, or perhaps for financial assistance from his uncle. Instead, he had received a response indicating that his uncle had discovered his real circumstances and was willing to exploit this discovery for financial gain. This was the blackmail that Henry had mentioned to David Pearson, the evidence that would give him leverage over someone. Stephen Blackwood was that someone, and the evidence was whatever information Henry had uncovered about Stephen's past. So Stephen had motive, Inspector Lamb said, pacing back and forth in the village hall while Miss Marple sat quietly observing. He could have come to the village, accessed the flat, applied the poison to the cup hours before his uncle drank from it. But how would he have known that his uncle would drink from that particular cup? And how would he have known the correct timing to ensure that the poison would be active when the cup was eventually used? These are excellent questions, Miss Marple agreed, and they suggest, perhaps, that Stephen was not the sole architect of the crime. There may have been another person involved, someone who was present in the flat, who could ensure that the poisoned cup was used at the correct time, and who had some familiarity with the routine of the household. The implication hung in the air. There was only one person who fitted this description, Margot Blackwood. Yet Margot had insisted on her innocence, and there had been no evidence connecting her directly to the actual administration of the poison. Could she have been complicit without being directly guilty? I believe, Miss Marple said slowly, that I can explain the matter if you will permit me to describe a theory based on the evidence. Detective Inspector Lamb seated himself across from her, his previous certainty entirely gone, replaced by an openness to any explanation that might make sense of the confusing tangle of evidence and motive. I believe, Miss Marple began, that Stephen Blackwood came to the village intending to meet with his uncle and to attempt to negotiate an end to the blackmail. He may have proposed a financial arrangement, or he may have intended to threaten his uncle. What is clear is that he was willing to take action to ensure that his uncle could not reveal the information that he had discovered. And Margot? The inspector asked. I believe that Margot was not willing, initially, Miss Marple continued, but I also believe that she was subject to considerable pressure from Stephen. Perhaps he represented himself as her ally against an uncle who was threatening to reveal information about her as well. Or perhaps he offered her something, freedom from her marriage, or financial security, in exchange for her cooperation. The nature of the arrangement is unclear, but the result is clear. She agreed to her husband's murder, but she could not have administered the poison on the afternoon of the poisoning, the inspector protested. She was observed in the shop, helping a customer. Precisely, Miss Marple said, which is why the poison must have been applied well in advance. Stephen came to the village, gained access to the flat, either through Margot's assistance or through some other means, and applied the poison to the cup. Then he departed. Margot, knowing what was to come, made certain that her husband used that particular cup at the appropriate time. She may have even facilitated his death by applying the poison to a new cup if the first application had failed to work, or by ensuring that he drank the poisoned tea by insisting that he take it while she was present and could direct him to use the poisoned cup. Inspector Lamb was quiet considering this theory. "It is plausible," he said at length, "but it remains theory. How can we prove it?" "You might ask Stephen Blackwood directly," Miss Marple suggested, "and you might examine his hands and his clothing. If he applied the poison as recently as the morning or evening before the poisoning occurred, there might be traces of the poison, or of whatever vehicle was used to apply it, remaining on his person. Strychnine has a distinctive odor when concentrated, and it is possible that traces might be detected by someone with chemical knowledge." The inspector rose and turned to Constable Barnes. "Send a telegram immediately to the police in the city. We need Stephen Blackwood taken into custody for questioning regarding the death of Henry Blackwood, and arrange for a specialist to examine his clothing and person for traces of poison. It was on the evening of the 17th day following Henry's death that Stephen Blackwood was brought to the village handcuffed and sullen, and placed in custody pending questioning. And it was during this questioning, conducted by Detective Inspector Lamb, with Miss Marple observing discreetly from a back room, that the full story emerged. Stephen Blackwood had indeed come to the village 3 months prior, intending to discuss with his uncle the possibility of ending the blackmail. He had learned that Henry had discovered information about his past, information that Stephen had been at considerable pains to conceal from his employer and his social circle. But his uncle had not been interested in discussion. Henry had been interested only in profit, and he had demanded a substantial payment, money that Stephen could not possibly raise, in exchange for his silence. Desperate and angry, Stephen had decided on a different course of action. He had poisoned a cup with strychnine and sent it to his uncle, intending that his uncle would drink from it and die. He had applied the poison to the exterior of the cup so that it would not be obvious in the tea itself, and he had timed his action so that the poison would be fully absorbed and would kill his uncle within hours. Yet he had not acted alone. Margot, who had been subjected to her own pressures by her husband, pressures related to financial matters and to his infidelity and to his generally difficult nature, had been willing to assist Stephen in exchange for her freedom and a promise of financial security. When Stephen was confronted with evidence of his guilt, traces of poison on his clothing, a handkerchief soaked in strychnine solution found in his lodgings in the city, financial records showing that he had been in contact with Margot and that they had been planning her departure from the village, he confessed to the crime with a kind of grim relief. "I did not mean to kill him immediately," he said at one point during his interrogation. "I meant only to make him ill, to frighten him into stopping the blackmail. But I misjudged the dose. The poison was too strong, and he died. When I heard that he was dead, I was not sorry. I was relieved." As for Margot, she was released from custody immediately upon Stephen's confession and subsequent conviction. She departed the village within a week, using the financial resources that Stephen had promised her in exchange for her complicity, and she was not heard from again. The verdict was guilty, returned after only a few hours of deliberation, by a jury that had been presented with incontrovertible evidence of Stephen Blackwood's culpability. He was sentenced to death, a sentence that would not be carried out until the following spring, giving him several months to contemplate his action and its consequences. The village of Little Hartleton returned slowly to its normal rhythms, though the rhythms were altered in ways that would persist for years to come. The corner shop, which had been at the heart of the community for more than 2 decades, was closed indefinitely and eventually sold to an outsider who turned it into a tea room, an establishment that struggled with the weight of the history that clung to its walls. Eleanor Blackwood, freed from the uncertainty that had surrounded her former husband's death, settled more deeply into her quiet life in her cottage. She was occasionally seen in the village, purchasing provisions and attending the church, but she did not participate in society as she had done before. Some villagers believed that she was content in her solitude. Others suspected that the trauma of the affair had left wounds that would not fully heal. David Pearson, freed from his debt upon Henry's death, a debt that was annulled as part of the settlement of the estate, since it seemed inappropriate to enforce a debt against a deceased man's creditors, remained in the employ of Henry's nephew Stephen, who took over the running of the corner shop until its eventual sale. David eventually married, not Patricia Denham, that match had been broken off by Patricia's mother in the wake of the scandal, but rather a school teacher from the neighbouring village. He left Little Hartleton and was not seen there again. Mrs. Watkins continued to work in the corner shop under its new proprietor, and she became something of a fixture in the village, known for her dignity and her refusal to discuss the crime, no matter how pressed by curious villagers. The Reverend Collins lost some of his congregation in the aftermath of the affair. Some parishioners were troubled by the revelation that he had been indebted to Henry Blackwood, but his position remained secure, and he continued his ministry with his characteristic gentleness and grace. Dr. Denham, whose debts to Henry had been a factor in the motivation for the crime, found himself relieved of those debts upon Henry's death. He did not leave the village, and he did not seek to hide from the knowledge that his financial difficulties had, in some sense, contributed to the motivation for the murder. He simply continued his practice, with perhaps a somewhat diminished practice, as some patients, those who had been sympathetic to Eleanor's position or who had been scandalized by the affair, chose to consult with the doctor in the neighbouring village instead. As for Miss Marple, she returned to her life of quiet observation and modest social participation. She did not seek recognition for her role in solving the crime. Detective Inspector Lamb was credited with the investigation in the official reports and in the newspaper accounts, and she seemed content to resume her knitting and her garden and her occasional consultations with the police on matters where her particular insights were deemed valuable. Yet it was not quite finished. There remained one more revelation to come, one that Miss Marple had suspected, but had not fully articulated until the case had been resolved and the legal proceedings had been concluded. It was on a grey afternoon in late autumn, more than a month after Stephen Blackwood's conviction, that Eleanor Blackwood called upon Miss Marple and asked to speak with her privately. Miss Marple received her in the sitting room, and Eleanor came directly to the point with the directness that Miss Marple had come to associate with her. "I came to thank you," Eleanor said. "I came to thank you for investigating the matter and for determining the true guilty parties. You did not have to do this. You could have allowed Margot to be convicted, and perhaps that would have been justice of a sort. She was complicit in my husband's death, after all." "I sought only the truth," Miss Marple said gently. "I know," Eleanor said, "and the truth, as it turned out, was more complex than it initially appeared. But I came to tell you something else, something that I have not revealed to anyone, not even to the police." Miss Marple waited, I knew, Eleanor said, that Stephen intended to harm Henry. I knew because Stephen wrote to me, asking if I would be willing to assist him. He offered me money, a considerable sum, if I would help him carry out his plan. He said that he would arrange for Henry's death, and that I would be free to remarry or to live my life as I wished, without the burden of a living ex-husband who was making my financial situation increasingly difficult. "And you refused?" Miss Marple asked. "I refused," Eleanor confirmed, "but not for the reasons one might suppose. I did not refuse because I had any remaining affection for Henry. I did not refuse because I believed the crime to be immoral. I refused because I knew that if I accepted Stephen's offer, I would become implicated in the crime, and I would be bound to Stephen by the knowledge of my complicity. I would be his accomplice, and he would hold that knowledge over me forever. I would have exchanged one form of bondage for another." "A wise judgment," Miss Marple said. "But there is more," Eleanor continued. "I also knew that Stephen intended to involve Margot. I knew because I had been observing their interactions. I had seen them together in the village, and I had seen the way they looked at each other. And I realized that Margot, who was unhappy in her marriage and who was perhaps looking for a way out, would be susceptible to Stephen's plan. I could have warned her. I could have told her that Stephen was dangerous, that she should not trust him. But I did not. I allowed events to proceed as they would. And I watched as both Stephen and Margot became ensnared in the consequences of their actions." "Why are you telling me this?" Miss Marple asked. "Because I wanted you to understand," Eleanor said. "I wanted you to understand that even someone like me, someone who considers herself to be moral and decent, is capable of allowing terrible things to happen. I had the opportunity to prevent a crime, and I chose not to take that opportunity. I am not innocent, Miss Marple. I am merely not guilty of the charge of murder." Miss Marple was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Guilt and innocence are complex matters, my dear. You chose not to participate in a crime. That choice, I believe, was made for the right reasons, not out of moral principle, but out of wisdom and self-interest. These are perfectly human motivations, and I do not believe they make you guilty of anything except being human." Eleanor left soon after, and Miss Marple did not see her again before Eleanor herself departed the village, moving to the city to be near her adult children. But Miss Marple had understood in that conversation something that she had long ago come to understand about human nature. That everyone was capable of moral failing, but not everyone was capable of recognizing their own failing and bearing the burden of that recognition with dignity and honesty. As the year drew to a close and the winter settled in upon Little Hartleton, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the case with the particular quality of contemplation that comes only when the crisis has passed, and there remains nothing but the slow work of understanding. She sat in her sitting room on a cold December afternoon, her knitting before her. The baby's blanket had been completed and sent off to its intended recipient, and she was now working on a scarf for the vicar, who had been particularly kind to the parish in recent months. And she thought about the crime and its perpetrators. Stephen Blackwood, she believed, had genuinely believed himself to be the victim of an injustice. His father's death had deprived him of an inheritance that he felt he was entitled to, and his uncle's later blackmail had seemed to him the ultimate insult. Not merely an injustice, but an injustice piled upon an earlier injustice. The poisoning, to his mind, had been not merely a solution to his immediate problem, but a form of justice, a settling of an account that had been open for more than 20 years. Margot, she believed, had been drawn into the crime not by malice, but by desperation. A marriage that had promised excitement and escape had become merely another form of bondage. Her husband was older than she had anticipated, more demanding, less genuinely interested in her as a person. And then Stephen had appeared, offering her not merely a way out, but a partnership, an alliance with someone who seemed to understand her desires and her frustrations. Eleanor had been trapped between two worlds, the world of the wronged wife and the world of the potential accomplice. She had chosen to be neither, to step back and allow events to unfold without her participation. This choice, which might appear to some to be a form of complicity through inaction, had seemed to Miss Marple to be a form of wisdom. As for Henry Blackwood himself, he had been a man who had built his life on small cruelties and larger betrayals. He had seduced a woman 20 years his junior and thereby lost the respect of his village. He had divorced a devoted wife and thereby created an enemy of time and circumstance. And most fatally, he had used his knowledge of his nephew's circumstances to extort money from him, thereby creating an enemy who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from his death. The question of what moral judgment should be rendered on each of these people was, Miss Marple understood, ultimately the question of what one believed human beings to be capable of, and what one believed about justice and mercy. She did not share her thoughts with anyone. Discretion, after all, was the primary virtue of her age and her position. But she did record them, in a small leather journal that she kept in her desk, for her own reference and for the occasional moment when she felt inclined to review her understanding of human nature. The crime of the corner shop, she wrote, was a crime of passion and desperation, rather than of greed. It was born not from malice, but from the accumulated weight of old injuries and new frustrations, and it was prevented from being discovered immediately only because a false trail, the obvious suspect, the convenient motive, was sufficient to direct the investigation elsewhere. This is a lesson about the nature of human judgment, that we believe what we expect to believe, and we see what we expect to see, and only great care and humility can allow us to see beyond our expectations to the truth that lies beneath. On the afternoon of Christmas Eve, Miss Marple attended the church service with her customary quiet dignity. The church was full. The Christmas service brought out those who attended only rarely, along with the faithful corps who maintained the parish through the year. The Reverend Collins preached with his customary gentleness about forgiveness and redemption, themes that seemed particularly pointed given the events of the year. Miss Marple listened with only half her attention to the words of the sermon, though her attention never wavered from the pulpit. The Reverend spoke about the possibility of renewal after tragedy, about the human capacity for both cruelty and kindness, about the importance of community and forgiveness. These were universal themes, not specific to the events of the year, but Miss Marple understood that the Reverend was speaking to his parishioners with full knowledge of what they had endured. After the service, there was the traditional gathering in the parish hall, where the church ladies served punch and Christmas biscuits, and the parishioners engaged in the careful conversation of people who have endured a shared trauma. Miss Marple moved among the gathered people with her characteristic grace, speaking briefly to each, listening carefully to the undertones of their speech. She noted that Eleanor Blackwood's absence was noticed, though not commented upon directly. She observed that the shop's former location had taken on something of the quality of a haunted place, avoided when possible, mentioned with a kind of nervous energy when its mention became unavoidable. She sensed that while the village had officially closed the case, moving on to the normal concerns of winter and the impending new year, the trauma of the affair had left marks that would not fade for many months or years to come. Later that evening, as she sat alone in her cottage with her knitting and her thoughts, Miss Marple received a visitor. Constable Barnes, come ostensibly to inquire after her health and her comfort, but in reality, she suspected, to engage her in a conversation about the case. "I wanted to thank you," Constable Barnes said, settling into a chair with his usual awkward courtesy. The inspector would have been satisfied to arrest Mrs. Blackwood, and to have called the case closed, if you had not insisted on examining the wider implications. An innocent woman, well, innocent of the murder charge at least, would have been convicted. That would have been a grave injustice, Miss Marple agreed, though I confess I was not entirely certain until quite near the end. There were too many theories that seemed plausible, too many people who had potential motives. "How did you know?" Constable Barnes asked. "How did you know that it was Stephen Blackwood who was guilty?" Miss Marple set down her knitting and considered the question carefully. "I observed certain things," she said, a newspaper photograph that matched a description provided by the solicitor, a pattern of behavior that suggested a man capable of harboring resentment over many years. And I listened to what people said, not merely the words, but the meaning beneath the words. When David Pearson spoke of Mr. Blackwood becoming impatient about the debt, I understood that something had changed in Mr. Blackwood's circumstances or his psychology. When Eleanor spoke of Margot's reaction to her husband's illness, I heard something that seemed inconsistent with guilt. And when you told me about the laboratory's findings regarding the poison application, I understood that we were dealing with someone capable of considerable planning and patience. But there were many people who could have poisoned him, Constable Barnes protested. "Why Stephen specifically?" "Because Stephen was the one person who had both a long-standing grievance and a recent provocation," Miss Marple said. "The long-standing grievance was the matter of the farm, an injury that had been festering for more than 20 years. The recent provocation was the blackmail, the knowledge that his uncle had discovered his secret and was using that knowledge to extract money from him. And he was also the one person who was sufficiently distant from the village to have the freedom to commit the crime without being immediately suspected. A person who lives in the village every day is observed, and patterns are noticed. A person who arrives and leaves is less susceptible to observation." "And Margot?" Constable Barnes asked. "Margot was driven by desperation and by the promise of escape," Miss Marple said. "She was unhappy in her marriage, and Stephen offered her a way out. She was also, I suspect, in love with Stephen, or at least believed herself to be. Love and desperation are powerful motivators, and they can drive ordinary people to extraordinary actions." Constable Barnes rose to leave, and as he did so, he paused at the door. "Do you think," he asked, "that Stephen Blackwood will be executed?" "I believe it is quite likely," Miss Marple said. "He has confessed, and the evidence is incontrovertible. The law must take its course." "And do you think he deserves to be executed?" Constable Barnes asked. Miss Marple was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I think that Stephen Blackwood committed a terrible crime, and that he must face the consequences of that action. Whether the consequence should be death, or imprisonment, or some form of redemption, That is a question that goes beyond my understanding. I can observe human nature, Constable. I cannot judge it. It was on a cold day in January, just as the new year was settling into its established patterns, that Miss Marple made her final visit to the corner shop. The building stood empty now, its windows dark, its interior stripped of the accumulation of goods and business that had characterized it for more than 2 decades. The proprietor's flat above was equally empty, waiting only for a new owner to bring new life to the space. Miss Marple stood on the pavement, her walking stick in her hand, her eyes moving across the facade of the building with the attention she might have given to a fine painting. She did not enter, there was no purpose in doing so, but she stood there for several minutes, considering the building and what had occurred within its walls. A crime had occurred here, a murder committed in the afternoon light, by people driven by motives both old and new. An elderly man had died, poisoned by his own nephew, assisted by his own wife, discovered by the patient observations of an elderly woman who made her business the study of human nature. And yet, the building remained simply a building. The stones and mortar were unchanged. The space itself was neither good nor evil, neither redemptive nor damnatory. It was merely a place where human events had unfolded, where human desires and fears had intersected with human actions and human consequences. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple." Miss Marple turned to find Eleanor Blackwood standing nearby. Eleanor had not, after all, departed the village immediately. She was preparing to do so, but she had returned one final time to put her affairs in order. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Blackwood," Miss Marple said. "I was reflecting on the events of the autumn." "It all seems very distant now," Eleanor said, moving to stand beside Miss Marple, and regarding the shop with an expression that was difficult to read, "though I suppose it will not seem distant for many years." "Memories fade," Miss Marple said gently. "The sharp edges of the event will wear smooth with time. We will remember that something occurred here, but the precise nature of what occurred will become less clear, less terrible. This is the mercy of time." "Do you believe that?" Eleanor asked. "I believe it because I have observed it," Miss Marple said. "I am 84 years old, and I have lived through many events that seemed, at the time, to be catastrophic and unforgettable. Yet time has taken the sharp edges off of most of them. I remember that they occurred, and I remember the general outlines, but the precise pain of the moment has faded into something more bearable." Eleanor nodded, and the two women stood in companionable silence for a few moments more. "I wanted to thank you," Eleanor said finally, "not for solving the crime, though I am grateful for that, but for understanding that the matter was more complex than it initially appeared, for not accepting the easy answer, but for pursuing the truth even when the truth was less convenient than the apparent answer would have been." "The truth is rarely convenient," Miss Marple said, "but it is always preferable to a comfortable falsehood." Eleanor departed soon after, and Miss Marple continued her walk through the village, passing the church where the Reverend Collins was tending to the Christmas decorations, passing the school where Miss Jennifer Hart was preparing for the return of the students after the holiday break, passing the ordinary lives of ordinary people in an ordinary village where extraordinary things had occurred and had then been absorbed into the fabric of the village's history. And as she walked, Miss Marple reflected on the nature of her investigation and the truth that it had revealed. That human beings are capable of both remarkable goodness and remarkable cruelty. And that the difference between these capacities is often a matter of circumstance and opportunity rather than of fundamental character. that the surface of life is often deceiving, and that the real truth lies underneath, accessible only to those patient enough and humble enough to seek it without prejudice or preconception. She reflected too on the concept of justice, that complex and often unsatisfying process by which societies attempted to maintain order and to punish wrongdoing. The justice system had worked after a fashion in the case of Stephen Blackwood. He had been caught, he had been tried, and he would be punished. And yet, was this justice? Was a man's execution a sufficient consequence for the act of poisoning? Did it bring back to life the man who had been poisoned? Did it ease the suffering of those who had been affected by the crime? These were questions that Miss Marple did not attempt to answer. She was not a philosopher, and she did not believe that the answers to such questions lay within her purview. She was simply an observer of human nature, an interpreter of patterns and behaviors, a seeker after truth. In a world that often seemed determined to obscure the truth beneath layers of convention and self-interest. As the evening descended and the winter darkness settled over Little Hartleton, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, where she built a fire and settled into her chair with her knitting. The scarf for the vicar was nearly complete, and she was already planning her next project, a new blanket perhaps, or a jumper for one of the village children. She did not dwell on the events of the autumn. Her mind, trained by decades of observation and reflection, moved forward to the new year and the new events that would inevitably unfold. The crime of the corner shop had been solved, the guilty party had been brought to justice, and life in Little Hartleton would continue in its ordinary patterns, marked by the passing seasons and the small dramas that comprised the substance of village life. And yet, in some quiet corner of her understanding, Miss Marple held the memory of the case, the knowledge of what human beings were capable of, the understanding that even in the most ordinary village, beneath the surface of propriety and social convention, there lay depths of motive and passion and desperation that could, in the right circumstances, drive people to actions that would astonish and horrify. This knowledge did not embitter her. She had held it for too long to allow bitterness to take root. Rather, it made her more compassionate, more careful in her judgments of others, more willing to acknowledge that all human beings were creatures of considerable complexity, capable of both virtue and vice, worthy of both condemnation and mercy. And so Miss Marple knitted, and the fire crackled, and the winter night settled over the village, and justice, in its imperfect and uncertain way, was served.